So, about 2,000 years ago in the Roman province of Judea, which is now part of Israel, there was a Jewish religious leader named Jesus who had been teaching people that God's kingdom was at hand for those who believed in him. The leading religious figures in the region didn't like this because they felt threatened by his popularity and his message. So they went to the local governor, Pontius Pilate, and told him that Jesus was stirring up unrest among the populace and asked him to execute Jesus as a threat to Roman authority. Pilate turned them down at first because he found no guilt in Jesus, but then his wife warned him to leave Jesus alone because he was going to be put to death anyway. So Pilate gave in and handed Jesus over to be crucified. And that's the story of how Jesus died. Or is it? Well, actually, it's pretty close. Let me explain. Scholars have used non-biblical sources to fill in some of the gaps in the biblical accounts of Jesus' trial and crucifixion, and they think it went something like this. On the morning of Passover, Jesus and his disciples celebrated the Jewish festival with a meal called the Last Supper, during which Jesus announced that one of his disciples would betray him. After leaving the supper, Jesus and his disciples went to a garden where Jesus prayed. Soon, soldiers from the temple guard arrived with a detachment of Roman soldiers led by a man named Lucanus. They were looking for Jesus so they could arrest him. One of Jesus' disciples identified him and told the soldiers, "You came to arrest Jesus, right? Well, here he is." Then the soldiers bound Jesus and took him before the high priest, who was the most important religious leader in Judaism at the time. His name was Caiaphas. He questioned Jesus about his teachings, but Jesus didn't answer. So Caiaphas tore up his clothes and sentenced him to death for claiming to be the Son of God and the Messiah. After this, the soldiers returned Jesus to the courtyard where Lucanus began mocking him and beating him. This was probably done to force Jesus to confess to a crime or renounce his claims to kingship, but it didn't work. Finally, Lucian sent Jesus on his way, giving him a Roman soldier's robe and telling him to go and be crucified. But the soldiers couldn't find a suitable cross, so they forced a passerby named Simon to carry it for him. Eventually, they reached Golgotha, also known as Calvary, where a wooden cross was set up and hammered into the ground. Then Jesus was stripped naked and fastened to the cross. Two criminals who had been condemned to death were crucified alongside him, one on his right and one on his left. Nails were driven through his wrists and ankles, and his side was pierced with a spear. Then he was hoisted up and left to hang while the soldiers gambled for his clothes. As Jesus hung there, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Around noon, darkness fell over the land for 3 hours, and around 3 p.m., Jesus cried out, "It is finished," and breathed his last breath. A centurion who was watching him ordered for him to be taken down and wrapped in a linen cloth, after which his body was placed in a tomb nearby. Some women who had followed Jesus from Galilee came and anointed his body with spices and perfumes, after which the entrance to the tomb was rolled away. They returned home, but early the next morning they went back to the tomb with some more spices. But when they arrived, they saw that the stone had been rolled away and an angel was sitting on it. The angel told them that Jesus had risen from the dead, after which he appeared to some of his disciples and told them to go tell all the nations that he had been raised from the dead. There are a few points worth making here. First, this was not the only account of Jesus' crucifixion. There were also Gospels written by Mark and Thomas, and there are also other early Christian writings, including the earliest, the letter of Paul to the Corinthians. Second, the Passion narrative we just looked at is based on Matthew's Gospel, which is one of the 4 canonical Gospels included in what Christians call the New Testament. In general, the 4 Gospels have a lot in common, but they also differ in significant ways. For example, Mark's Gospel ends with Jesus' resurrection without any appearances, and there's no mention of his post-resurrection appearances anywhere in Mark's Gospel. The big difference between Matthew's Gospel and Mark's Gospel is that in Matthew's, there's an additional section called the Resurrection Appearances, which details several instances in which Jesus appeared to his followers after rising from the dead. It's likely that Matthew wrote his gospel to address some concerns that Christians in his community had about Jesus' death and resurrection. For example, in Matthew's gospel, Jesus appears to his disciples and says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age." Scholars think that these verses might have served to reassure Christians who were worried that their mission was over after Jesus' death. Third, it's important to recognize that scholars can't agree on whether or not everything in the Bible is literally true, and the question of whether or not Jesus was crucified is no exception. For example, John Dominic Crossan, a prominent biblical scholar, argues that the crucifixion narratives should be understood metaphorically rather than literally. According to Crossan, crucifixion was the Roman state's method of executing slaves and people without citizenship, normally male, almost always male. Jesus was a Jewish preacher and a rabbi. His execution could not have been by crucifixion because that was reserved for slaves and non-citizens. Other scholars, however, point out that there's evidence of crucifixion outside of the Bible. For example, a Jewish historian named Josephus Flavius wrote that in 66 CE, a Jewish rebel named Simon Bar Giora led a group of zealots in a revolt against the Romans. Bar Giora was eventually cornered and crucified along with 40 of his comrades. Another piece of extra-biblical evidence comes from a Roman historian named Tacitus, who wrote that the Emperor Nero blamed Christians for starting a fire in Rome and subjected them to the cruelest tortures. Many were crucified under the gloating laughter of the spectators, and Crossan himself admits that there may have been a handful of cases in which Jews were crucified. However, he believes that the idea that Jesus was crucified is ultimately a symbolic one that reflects the Jewish understanding of the kind of suffering servant that the Messiah would be. Fourth, even if we grant that Jesus was crucified, there's still the question of whether or not he rose from the dead. And even if we grant that he did rise from the dead, there's the further question of whether or not this event actually happened in the way that it's described in the Bible. There are different views on this issue within Christianity itself, with some Christians believing in a bodily resurrection, in which Jesus' physical body actually rose from the dead, while others believe that the resurrection was more of a spiritual event. And outside of Christianity, people have proposed all sorts of different explanations for Jesus' resurrection, such as the swoon theory, which posits that Jesus never really died on the cross and that when Joseph of Arimathea came to take his body down, he was mistaken for being dead. And then there's the hallucination theory, which proposes that the women who went to the tomb early on the Sunday morning were hallucinating when they thought they saw Jesus' body missing and an angel sitting on the stone. In the end, I'm not going to try to argue that any one of these theories is correct. Rather, my goal has simply been to show how the story of Jesus' death and resurrection has developed over time, and how different people have interpreted it in different ways. What I will say, however, is that regardless of how we might choose to understand this event, the story of Jesus' death and resurrection has had a profound impact on the world. As the philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach once said, "The history of the development of this religion shows us the development of humanity itself." Hey everyone, thanks for watching this episode of the Crash Course series. This series is filmed at a studio and made in partnership with a digital studio and nature. You want to help keep Crash Course free for everyone forever? You can join our community on a crowdfunding platform